Girls are running the world and it's not going well. So-called artists reimagine Confederate monuments and the many reasons why you shouldn't cheer for surrogacy. All that and more on the Kylee Cast. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Kylee Cast. I'm Kylee Griswold, Managing Editor at the Federalist. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We've got a brand new channel exclusively for the Kylee Cast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So if you're only subscribed to the Federalist Radio Hour or you're wrong, be sure to subscribe to the Kylee Cast as well. If you're just listening to the show, be sure to check out the full video version on my personal YouTube channel or the Federalist channel on Rumble. If you'd like to email the show, you can do so at radio@thefederalist.com. I would love to hear from you. I read an article this week that I can't stop thinking about, and in fact, it seems to have caught a lot of people's attention. It's a piece by Helen Andrews in Compact magazine called The Great Feminization. And in it, she makes the case, quite persuasively, in my opinion, that everything we would conceptualize as wokeness is the byproduct of a feminized society en masse. I mean, just think about it. Political correctness, identity politics, the Me Too movement, cultural affirmative action, DEI, social emotional learning, all of it involves, in Helen's words, quote, prioritizing the feminine over the masculine. Empathy over rationality, safety over risk, cohesion over competition, end quote. This is in part explained by the general differences in how men and women approach conflict. While men are wired for war, they're primed to compartmentalize, they deal with conflict directly and swiftly, women tend to be much more cooperative and risk averse. Instead of dealing with their competitors head on, like men do, they tend to isolate or undermine them quietly and behind the scenes. Helen writes, quote, men tend to be better at compartmentalizing than women, and wokeness was in many ways a society-wide failure to compartmentalize. Traditionally, an individual doctor might have opinions on the political issues of the day, but he would regard it as his professional duty to keep those opinions out of the examination room. Now that medicine has become more feminized, doctors wear pins and lanyards expressing views on controversial issues from gay rights to Gaza. They even bring the credibility of their profession to bear on political fads, as when doctors said Black Lives Matter protests could continue in violation of COVID lockdowns because racism was a public health emergency, end quote. She observes that probably the most detrimental sector of this feminization is the legal profession, because, after all, we all rely on law and order and blind justice, a reliable legal system that can call balls and strikes against an impartial law. Helen says, quote, to be blunt, the rule of law will not survive the legal profession becoming majority female. The rule of law is not just about writing rules down. It means following them even when they yield an outcome that tugs at your heartstrings or runs contrary to your gut sense of which party is more sympathetic, end quote. It's a long article. There's plenty more to agree with, but readers also found some disagreements too. My colleague Joy Pullmann is an author and the executive editor at The Federalist, and she wrote a response piece to Helen Andrews this week in The Federalist titled, Western Culture Isn't Feminized, It's Transgender. And she joins me now to discuss. Joy, welcome. Thanks so much for coming on the Kylee Cast.
Thank you, Kylee.
Joy, I did want to highlight what I think was probably your favorite passage of Helen's article, and it was also mine. She wrote, quote, women can sue their bosses for running a workplace that feels like a fraternity house, but men can't sue when their workplace feels like a Montessori kindergarten. Naturally, employers err on the side of making the office softer. So if women are thriving more in the modern workplace, is that really because they are outcompeting men? Or is it because the rules have been changed to favor them? End quote. So I think you would largely agree with that sentiment.
Oh, yeah.
And I want to start by just asking you to detail, what do you think are Helen's strongest points? Like, what in this article do you agree with?
I actually would say that I agree with at least 95% of her article. I just, in mine, kind of wanted to extend it and think about some of the language that she's using.
Hmm.
So for example, I kind of, I guess it's a little difficult for me to hear all of these really terrible things described to feminization when it's kind of only half of the story. I
Mm.
really see, so the things that she and in my response, I linked to some work I've done, kind of engaging with a lot of different people who have kind of made similar arguments over the past couple of years on the right. Kind of like the longhouse argument, for example, is a really popular sort of thing. And I do see a lot of those as being negative aspects of women, but what I see as missing, and if you're going to use the word feminine or feminization, but exclude all of the positive things about what women do, I think that's where the problem for me comes in. And so I would just love for people, to use more of a refined term, such as maybe toxic femininity, to
Mm.
talk about, kind of these, girls gone bad sorts of things, these dynamics in our culture, because I think it is important, to really talk about the other half of that, what women do that is good. There are actually a lot of feminine attributes that we're really missing in our culture and that are not only left out of the conversation, but a lot of, women's lives, everyday lives now. So I think we've just really lost a complete picture of what femininity means and what, the good parts of it could be. And I really think if we brought back more of those good parts, we would have less of the bad.
Yeah, so you write in your piece that society actually isn't feminine at all. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I mean, just when I look at around at our society, I do not see a feminine world. I see a world that is very hostile to women and to children, who I kind of see as, one of the top concerns of a well-adjusted woman is, how the children are doing, right?
Hmm.
And I think biologically speaking, psychologically speaking, a lot of the uniqueness about women as compared to men is because of our orientation towards children,
Hmm.
whereas man, an inward orientation towards the home, towards children, raising them, while men tend to have more of an outward orientation, kind of more outward facing, if you would think of that. So our society is extremely hostile to children and to women. So if you look at, for example, I mean, I think the kind of the just one thing that we never talk about or we pretend is a really good thing is the sexualization of our culture. Walking
Hmm.
around now, I'm just seeing naked women all the time, everywhere I go, billboards, I mean, so I can't, I use Pinterest, for example, to get recipes, right? Like I store my recipes on there. And so I'm flipping through it while my kids are watching. There are bra ads like every single page on my Pinterest, and they're not, I'm totally comfortable with bras. I like, I wear them. I want to wear nice ones, nothing wrong with that. But like these are basically what I would consider soft porn advertisements,
Hmm.
and I have a 7-year-old, looking at me, helping me in the kitchen, with dinner, and she's seeing really straight up pornographic stuff. And that's completely wrong. And there's no warning on it. And that, I think that's just because it's become normalized. Other people don't see it as pornographic, but it really is. And that's
Hmm.
just because, everybody's watching porn. Our culture is just really, transformed in that direction. But that is not a pro woman thing, because really the value of women decreases when other women are putting out, right? The way that
Hmm.
women get the commitment that we want, the security, of marriage, the, a man to provide for us while we're vulnerable, having children, really we have to have this compact with other women that they're not going to be servicing, men sexually for free. Otherwise, it really bids, down the price of reserving that for a guy and what you have to offer for him in a
Right.
marriage. So that's, one of the things that I bring up in the article. I mean, our culture is really, treating women like men, basically saying in order for women to get ahead in life or to be given any sort of recognition or honor, they have to neuter themselves with chemicals, really mess with their, their emotions, their entire bodies,
Mm.
dump themselves full of synthetic hormones with the pill and all kinds of other
Hmm.
contraception. There's zero regard given for the fact that women are biologically different than men, and accommodations for that sort of thing. Rather, women are basically said, freeze your eggs, screw kids, you don't really want those, and just push into career is the only way that you get any value. I think that's inherently anti-woman. It's sold to us as pro-women, but I think it's deeply anti-woman because it negates who we are as fertile, different than men beings in order to gain any sort of honor, acceptance, or pats on the back.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and there's so many things we see regularly that are just I don't know how you square them with this idea that society that feminization is just the best way to describe exactly what's happening in society, right? So it's not feminine at all to look at a protest and see half naked women screaming in the faces of police officers. There's nothing
Right.
feminine about that. Or
That is
there's
not
nothing.
feminine.
Right. Or when Helen writes about women prioritizing safety over risk, well, are women prioritizing safety over risk when they take chemical abortion pills prescribed to them by a
No
telehealth
kidding.
practitioner that, could send them to the ER and bleed out hemorrhaging, because they might have an ectopic pregnancy that they don't know about, or something. We've been told this is feminized because this is what feminism looks like, quote unquote, but there isn't anything feminine about it at all. And you talk a little bit about the fertility rates in your piece. I'd also just love to hear you talk a bit about other ways that we have just an anti-child culture, from abortion to not having children friendly events, or,
Mhm.
weddings, or whatever else might fit into that
Well, I
category.
loved your monologue last week, for example, talking about the ghoulishness, in people's yards. That's completely anti-children, right? A
Mm,
couple blocks from my home, we've got like this, basically guy, in a noose decapitated, with all this blood dripping all around. What am I not supposed to let my children play in the neighborhood, where they live, so that they don't have to see terrifying things that haunt them in their sleep? And I know, I mean, I saw the replies on that. People with deadened consciences, sitting there being like, "What's wrong with you? Want to have a little fun?" No, these people have warped consciences. They're not thinking about the children. They're basically, putting themselves first over what if they had kids, they would have a better. I mean, some people can have kids and still be totally messed up and not great people, but that it does tend to have a refining effect on the majority of people. And people absolutely are less likely to put out that kind of gore and garbage. And that's just a really trivial surface example, of our culture's kind of anti-kid nature. But I really think, just the fact that women don't want babies nowadays. I think it's 50%, of women under 50 actively don't want children. That is almost unheard of in the history of humankind. Women always wanted children. To the extent that there are old ancient stories about women. It's kind of a trope, right? A woman gets a baby and then she ignores her husband, right?
mhm.
Or the husbands have to compete with the baby for the wife's attention after the baby comes. And so it is a innate biological, female wired in sort of thing to want a baby. And so the fact that we have, included among them have been working on that feministization process for myself, right? But it is a real problem when you have a society where people treat babies as trash, disposable, disgusting, all of these opposite of the true natural biological correct action of an actual female.
Yeah. Well, and in the piece specifically, Helen talks about the New York Times staff, for instance, that I forget the year she used, but it was 10% female, and now it's like vastly more female staff at the New York Times, and how that affects the way that people perceive things. Because, of course, no matter if you're reading the New York Times on a regular basis or not, it sets the terms of debates, and it determines what's in the news, and so on and so forth. Um, but it's just interesting because then you'll have corporate media, legacy media running articles. I think this was from the Times, although it may have been the Washington Post. So many of those are just indistinguishable in my mind at this point. But about, the motherhood penalty, where they're running a
Oh
piece
yeah.
about how awful it is to be a mother and how women are just totally screwed once they have a baby, and that's not a unique
Where
piece. I
are
mean, they
there
run this kind of stuff
articles
all the
about the
time.
rich tech bros, or the women who sold their eggs, and have no one to live with for
Hmm.
the rest of their life after their egg, their entire uterus dries up at 50, who are lonely, they have no one to come home to but their dogs or potted plants, who are staring at the second half of their life with nothing to look forward to besides freaking money. That
Hmm.
is absolutely a set of articles that could be run, right? That would be the mirror image of that. And then you can show, the women of relief, they have someone to come home to, they have someone to snuggle with, they have, grandkids games to go to, they have meaning in their life, they have people who need them and rely on them and love them and want them like no one else. And I mean, that's, so I go off for work for a business trip, I come home, for the next week, I'm like the celebrity at home. The kids are all like all over me, mommy, mommy, mommy. And you can either take that as, oh, that's so annoying, or you can be like, wow, these people love me like nobody else. I'm such a rich person, rich in
Yes.
the matters so much more than money.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, you can argue that it's what our modern culture would define as feminine, but what it really is feminist. It's their definition of this
Which is
thing that they've
anti-man,
totally
which is
hijacked.
anti-sex.
Yes, yes, they're wearing feminine as a skin suit when really feminism is
Exactly.
the antithesis to everything that is feminine. Um, your headline is pretty punchy. I want to know, what do you mean when you say that Western culture is transgender?
Well, so the what I mean by that simply is that, as we're discussing, women are not pushed to act like women, they're pushed to act like men nowadays. But also the corollary is true. Men are not pushed to act like men, they are pushed to act like women, right? So we
Hmm.
have this total swap. We don't have we have the feminization of men, but we have the masculinization of women. And so
Hmm.
that's why I say that our culture is transgender, because if it was truly a feminine culture, I think we would see some of the good things about being feminine as well as the women. But instead, we only have the trashy garbage stuff about women being bleached to both sexes, and the masculinization being extended to women. So I think rather than we just have one sided equation here, which I think rather than it being a one sided kind of situation, we have a dual sided, we have a swap. And that's of course because the sexes live in balance with each other. We are a dynamic, we're interrelated, we can't have one without the other. Men are not to women as a fish is to a bicycle. And men and women need each other, we can't get by without each other, and we have to figure out how to live together in happiness and harmony, rather than being at war all the time.
Yeah. I want to put up a passage from your piece, actually, because this gets to that point, and I thought it was just really excellent. You write uh, about a speech you delivered a year ago to the Eagle Forum, and you write, quote, "Are we experiencing a cultural over-feminization? It looks to me like instead we have a swap. We have feminization where there should be masculinity and masculinization where there should be femininity. Our women are pushed to act like men and are meant to act like women, and the resulting social transgenderism makes everyone extremely unhappy, not to mention dysfunctional," end quote. And then I love this part. "Do we have too many weak men and unhinged women? Absolutely." It's a foregone conclusion. I'd argue, however, that's because our society has reversed men and women's roles, and in so doing, abandoned both masculinity and femininity. We are not too feminine. Our women are not feminine enough, and our men are not masculine enough. I thought that was such a good point, and it just seems to me that what you're saying is that it's really a problem of disordering society. So these feminine traits would actually be good if they were rightly ordered toward child rearing, but they're catastrophic when they're brought into the boardroom or brought to
Right,
to
safety before
dominate
risk
men
is a
instead
good
of
way to
children.
protect a baby.
Say that again?
Oh, I said safety before risk is a good way to protect a baby.
Yes.
And to putting risk
Exactly.
above safety is a good way for a man to protect his family, right? He puts himself in front of the bullet, right? He goes and checks out the funny noise in the garage, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, that's such a great point. I also love that you bring it all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Helen talks a lot about how this overfeminization is unprecedented. And I mean, in many ways, it is. We have somewhat of a unique problem in 21st century America in its current form. But at the same time, there's nothing new under the sun. And men have been abdicating this leadership role and blaming women for the results since the very first man and woman, since the very first sin. I mean, this is not a new thing.
Well, right. And I mean, so this is tricky, I mean, to talk about, but I think at the bottom line is if men really are supposed to be the leaders, the heads of the households, the heads of government, the heads of society, if they really have that role, naturally speaking, then, a leader doesn't whine and refuse to take responsibility and blame shift. I mean, and so
Mhm.
really men are abdicating their masculinity and their leadership role when they sit around and just whinge about how women are the problem. I agree that many women are a problem. And I agree that a lot of women have been socialized to be dysfunctional, not helpful, antagonistic to man. I understand that men have a very big uphill legal and cultural battle, in order to kind of, a very, it's not going to be an easy, kind of cakewalk, to kind of take the places that they believe are rightfully theirs and to kind of reverse the situation. And I do think that women need to be in partnership with them and helping, men with this task, just as we, are supposed to be in partnership with and helping men with every good thing. But at the same time, where does the buck stop? Anyone
Mhm.
who is a leader knows. I mean, I know in our society this is messed up too, but right, but traditionally speaking, a society with accountability, the leader takes responsibility for what other people's failures under his leadership or lack of leadership. And so,
Mhm.
if the men are saying, it's right, women are trying to be, the she boss, taking, wearing the pants, blah blah blah. Okay, but you're letting them, and
Mhm.
that's on you. And
Right.
so, I mean, I don't. In saying this, of course, I think there are stupid ways to go about writing that problem, and there's smarter ways to do it. And I want men to do that in a smart way. But
Yes.
I just, I do think acknowledging and talking about the situation is the first step, but just sitting there is not acceptable, and it's not going to get people anywhere.
Yeah, let's get into a little bit of what you think some of the right ways are to right the ship here, because Helen offers nuking anti-discrimination laws as a good way to start reversing this trend. Because what happens is, because corporations and other institutions are afraid of lawsuits, if it doesn't look
Mhm.
like they have enough women on their employee roster, then they can be sued and lose just, I mean, so many figures worth of money. There have been, she detailed a number of companies that have fallen into this. I think Coca-Cola was one. There were plenty of others. And so of course you're always going to have this trend toward overhiring women so that you don't get sued. And so of course getting rid of some of these anti-discrimination laws would help that, because you would have more of a market correction there. But how else? How else do we fix not only the what she calls the over-feminization, but this transgenderism of society that you talk about?
Well, I think one thing that could help is for people to back men who do masculine and courageous things,
Mm,
that really get a lot of, female style whining and response. So, for example, take, the very recent issue, the Young Republicans group chat, right? Those were a bunch of men basically making masculine jokes, and someone wanted to be a traitor to them and, dox them, in the public. I think, and so those men, have been basically, turned on. I think they need to be backed the same way that Elon Musk, when he had some doxing of the young men that he was hiring for Doge, he put out a public poll. He said, okay, they said some stupid stuff. They're sorry for it. Or if it was public, they wouldn't have said it that way. Should I rehire them? A majority of people said absolutely rehire them, right? And I think the same thing, would be the way to treat the Young Republican group's text. Obviously, they do not actually support, putting people in ovens. They're not Hitler supporters.
mhm,
Those are jokes, and young men say, just ridiculous stuff to each other all the time. They tell their best friends, they call them swear words, blah, 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 all of this ridiculous stuff that they don't believe, and that's understood, in male culture. And so I think men really need to have the backing. They need to know that people have their back if they're going to get out there and act like act like a man. That people are not going to, turn on them and knife them for displaying basic male behavior. I mean, it's ridiculous, that young, men can be in trouble for making jokes like that. While, we have powerful people, for example, in the Senate, there's all of these, concealed agreements about, actual sexual assault, done by senators, congressmen, and their staffers, and nothing is happening to them. It's all being concealed, right? So there's just a ridiculous hierarchy that basically needs to be upended by people with power, backing people who men when they behave like men when they're actually not doing anything wrong. And we
mhm,
also I think we do see some masculine kind of leadership out of the Trump administration that a lot more people need to kind of emulate. When they do something that's bold, that is obviously good for people, that has obviously a lot of support, but they get the kind of attempted cancel culture sort of stuff, they just ignore it. They say you're stupid and they move on. And that's really what should happen, with other people, not just those who have the clout or the level, of a JD Vance or a Donald Trump, but the people who are under them who are trying to put things to order, in an aggressive way. Different, for example, attorneys general of states are also, have taken on that mold.
mhm.
I think, more governors, more state lawmakers really need to just be refashioning themselves into, the masculine, like, I don't care about what you're going to say. I care about the results here. And we're going to do them because we have the authority given to us by the voters, kind of thing. And
Mhm.
so, more of that needs to be happening with Republican elected officials. And, the people who do that need to be backed by their voters, backed by their donors, backed, by, whatever supporters or people, they need to be given jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So that, basically the ability to take people down for taking masculine action evaporates completely.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's probably a role on a more interpersonal level too.
Oh yeah.
Not the screw you, I don't care what you say when you're getting tisked, by the local Karen on your Facebook page or whatever, but more so just normalizing rational responses to things, asking people follow-up questions. Why do you feel comfortable saying that? Or, in there's a lot of workplaces where the crazy HR Karens, whether or not they're actually in an HR position, just the more like Karen lefties feel very comfortable saying exactly what they think about anything and correcting anybody who says anything that they view as stepping, a little over the line from a conservative perspective, or, a little too fraternity house-ish, as Helen would say. But nobody feels comfortable pushing back on the Karens who push a little bit too far in the other direction, or who, say things that are anti-religion at work, or things that are just like, you know, that should be out of bounds from the other direction. And so I think just we've seen people model this really well lately, like watching Allie Beth Stuckey's Jubilee interview, the way that she challenges a lot of these, culturally feminine preconceived ideas that are more tug at your heartstrings arguments rather than rational discussion, I think is such a good model for people in their interpersonal life. It doesn't just need to come from the top down. We can fix this from the bottom up, or at least make progress.
Well, so I do think that this toxic femininity is largely created by, male acquiescence and refusal to kind of stand up and take authority. I just think that more people, both men and women, need to practice and enforce just saying no to toxic females.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to participate in this situation. No, I disagree with you, and we can just leave it there. If they keep it up, say, I left it there. But practicing whatever, forms of just saying no and sticking by your no and just refusing to allow their, ridiculous cluster B tactics to dominate the situation. We need a lot more practice with that, because I think kind of the lack of boundaries, the lack of social norm enforcement, that's going on, it allows like kind of the chaos agents to have full reign of the public square. And so there needs to be a lot more people saying no and enforcing their no in whatever situation that you're in when somebody is being really toxic in, a feminine way.
Yeah, absolutely. Joy, great insights. Thank you so much for joining me. Everybody should go read Joy's article, Western Culture Isn't Feminized, It's Transgender. Go give it a read. And Joy, I hope to have you back again very soon.
Thank you.
All right, next up, there is a crazy story we need to talk about this week, which involves a new museum exhibit that features those Confederate statues that went away over the past few years, but they are back in a different form than they went away. And here to discuss that with me is my colleague and friend, Elle Purnell. You've seen her before. You love her. Welcome, Elle.
Hey, Kylie. Great to be back.
She is the assignment editor at the Federalist, and she is also bringing with her a secondary special guest, which is a brand new addition to her family. I should clarify. She got a dog. She got a puppy. Tell us about your dog, Elle.
Yeah, so you might see her interrupting our our recording here, so I apologize. But we've got a little yellow lab puppy, and she is absolutely wonderful, but definitely in the biting phase that they always warn you about. So we'll see how far she lets me get before she interrupts me.
Yeah, we'll see what we can do. But if you hear anybody chewing in the background, it's Skipper. It's not Elle. So
yeah, it's not me.
Don't be fooled. Yeah, I'm not going to call you a dog mom though, because that term offends me. So you're a dog owner now.
I like to say that dogs are members of the family, but not children.
That's a great distinction. Yeah, and a very Federalisty take. So way to just bring that in there. Yeah. Well, Elle, you wrote a piece this week. It's out today. It's about these old Confederate statues, monuments that have been restored, I put that in quotes, to a museum exhibit. Your piece is called Left-Wing Cultural Revolutionaries Are Decapitating Statues and Calling It Art. The statue in question it was formerly a statue of Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate leader. But the statue no longer looks like Stonewall Jackson. Can you fill us in on what exactly happened to this, what the exhibit entails, and just kind of describe the coverage of this museum exhibit?
Yeah, so a lot of people are probably familiar with the Robert E. Lee statue that used to stand in downtown Charlottesville. It was voted to be removed by the city council several years ago, and there were a lot of people unhappy about that. And of course, you have the Unite the Right demonstration. That's where you get the very good people on both sides hoax from the media. And so that Robert E. Lee statue was removed. It was, I think, given to some kind of organization, and that organization ended up, maybe it was a museum, ended up melting it down and kind of in secret. But then afterwards, they broadcast this really kind of haunting video of his face, which had, like, I guess, been cut off of the rest of the monument, just glowing orange, being melted down slowly.
Yeah, it was in secret, but it was also in the most grotesque way possible and seemed very intentional. There was no reason to decapitate the statue before then incinerating it or melting it down, I guess, and then broadcasting that specific component of it, that they literally got his head. How insane.
Yeah, it was secret until it happened, and it was in your face everywhere.
Right.
But a lot of people, I think, don't know that 2 blocks away from where the Robert E. Lee statue stood in what was formerly known as Lee Park, there was a Stonewall Jackson statue, and that was also removed by the city council at the same time. There was also a Lewis and Clark statue, which was removed because it included a depiction of Sacagawea that was, I guess, I don't know what was problematic about it, but that was removed too. But the Stonewall Jackson statue was given to a museum in Los Angeles, I think right before Glenn Youngkin became the governor of Virginia. And this museum has been holding on to it and gave it to this artist to play with, essentially. And what she did to it was dismember it. So it's a statue of Stonewall Jackson riding his war horse. And she cut it up in little pieces. She started by cutting his head off. And if you look at the statue now, such that it is, not only has its head been removed, but its face has been removed from its head. And so she chopped it up into these pieces, and then she kind of melded them together into this grotesque, like you've got a horse leg sticking out here, and then a man's head hanging kind of like on the top from the horse parts, and then you've got like the man's arm coming out of the other part of the horse. And so it's just this like mangled wreckage of a piece. And that is the centerpiece of this new exhibit in Los Angeles called Monuments, which also includes several other Confederate memorials and monuments, many of which still bear the markings that were left by demonstrators and rioters who threw paint on them or graffitied them or otherwise desecrated them.
Yeah, so when people talk about putting these monuments in context, the context now is that they're not being put in a place that's less public where people can go and see them and read about the historical context of them. The quote unquote context for these monuments now is that the mob, the violent mob, the demonstrators, the rioters got the last word. They're completely defaced. One of them has its face completely bashed in. One of them says, "Beware traitors." They're covered in red paint. They're completely defaced. And it's just so sad and twisted that that's who got the last word on these. I want to highlight an excerpt from the piece. You talked about Kara Walker, the quote unquote artist of this Stonewall Jackson piece. But it said this in, I believe it was the New York Times coverage of it. I'm just going to put up an excerpt for people who are watching, but I'll read it for you too. It says, quote, "She made the work at a foundry in upstate New York. The first step in the process," she said, "was, quote, a really kind of gruesome beheading of the Jackson figure that," she said, "left her unsettled. Though some people present applauded as the head came off, she said, quote, I actually felt like it was such a violent act that I was really uncomfortable with it," end quote. But she felt there was no alternative. Quote again, "I knew that what I was going to do was going to involve not having the head in its right place." She goes on to say that she chose not to visit Charlottesville to study the sculpture's past or recent context. Instead, she decided to treat its theme as a symbol of the pervasive ideology of the lost cause of the South. And she says, "This was basically mine now, my found object." She said she resolved to treat it as, quote, an object to be played with and contended with and wrestled with as an artist. I have so many reactions reading this. The first is just the fact that she identifies how violent the act is of beheading this statue and ripping its face off. She understands the moral component of this, but proceeds with it anyway. And then it's so crazy to me that she talks about the fact that she is intentionally not grappling at all with the context of this statue and is instead just using it as her personal racial justice play thing. And Elle, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean, when we all were told back in 2020 and before that in 2017, when the Charlottesville thing happened, that these Confederate statues were just going to go to museums, I don't think this is what any of us had in mind.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't put it past some of these artists or organizations to have had this in mind from the beginning, but it certainly was not what was conveyed to the public. You know, it's interesting. So it's interesting that, yeah, she recognizes that it's violent and then says that she has to do it anyway. And I think there's maybe some scary parallels there mm-hmm. for the ways that people who believe that America has not and perhaps cannot peacefully be rid of what they would consider its original sin what they believe is violent but necessary to kind of excise the demons from our society, the way that she sees herself as doing with this statue.
You had a really great quote in your piece to that point, just to put a fine point on that. You say, quote, "The BLM industrial complex is predicated on the belief that America and Western civilization at large are a bourgeoisie that must be punished and punished collectively for the sins of capitalism and colonialism. If you don't believe me, go read Ibram Kendi. Punishments range from being passed over for college acceptance to being stabbed on a train." And of course, that's a reference to Irina Zarutska, which was not a random act of violence. I mean, it was, but the perpetrator who specifically called out the fact that he had gotten that white girl. This was racially motivated, clearly, in his own words. This is violent, and it's a perfect parallel for the fact that, like, this is violent, but it must be done.
Yeah, I mean, and so the things that, there are plenty of ways to legitimately critique the sins and the faults of the slaveholders, the South, Civil War, what have you. Just as there are, by the way, with every moment of civilization since the fall in the garden. So there are legitimate critiques to be had there, but that's not what this is. The critiques that are being leveled here are the same exact critiques that are leveled against our modern America and going back to the founding. So you have like the accusations against these Confederate generals, right, are that they defended a way of life that was intrinsically dependent on slavery, on racism. And that's the same accusation that's being leveled against America today. It's the same accusation inherent in the 1619 Project against the America of the Founding Fathers. And so if this is what they will do to representations of those who defended a racist society, if they would level the same accusations against our society today, against America for its entire lifetime. And so if they're willing to do that to the statues, history shows us that when statues are destroyed, people always come next.
Yes. Sean Davis, the CEO of the Federalist, made this point very explicitly in a recent Senate testimony, where he said it starts with censorship, it moves on to statues, and ultimately it ends with people. And it's not always racial. Like this is just how Marxism and all of this works itself out. But we saw that this happened with Charlie Kirk. I mean, this happens all of the time. It's not just the iconoclasm of metal and other materials. It is the takedown of people. Go ahead.
To that point, but just before we move on, these statues obviously are not human beings. They're made of bronze, but they're symbols. And there is meaning for these Marxists in destroying these symbols. And I think there's a lot of things today that they would also view as symbols. I mean, even think of the argument for reparations. You and I obviously have never owned slaves, would never own slaves. But because we share a skin color with people who did in the past, it is demanded of us that we pay the punishment. And so we're symbols in the same sense, kind of as these statues are. We are the propitiatory, that is being asked to make the payment for the sins of the forefathers. So that, I mean, so to see what they're willing to do to a statue, and to know that they believe the same things of you and I purely because of our skin color and our existence as Americans, it's terrifying.
Right. Well, and we see that all the time. It does start with statues and moves on to people, but people are symbols too. I mean, Irina Zarutska in many ways is just a symbol of white women. Charlie Kirk in many ways is a symbol of conservative Christians. A lot. This was said often during Donald Trump, all of the lawfare and everything, and the assassination attempts against him. It was, "They're after you, I'm just in the way." In many ways, Donald Trump is the embodiment of MAGA Americans or MAGA extremists or whatever Joe Biden and all the rest of the Democrats, brand half of the country as. And so you're so right about the symbols point, but the symbols don't even stop at material things. It's not just flag burning and monument toppling. It's also taking out people who personify these things. And that's a huge, huge problem. I want to put up a tweet you included in your article. It's from our colleague, John Daniel Davidson. Excellent tweet. He says, the New York Times writer says the exhibit of defaced Confederate monuments, quote, faces down past and present hatreds with startling confidence, end quote. But that's wrong, because the exhibit is itself a manifestation of present hatreds, projected back into our shared past, flung forward at our posterity, and aimed directly at those alive today who would have preserved these monuments untouched. The entire exhibit is a monument to hatred in the present day of country and countrymen.
John is absolutely right, as usual. The exhibit is not just about, the goal is not to put history in any kind of artistic or historical context. The goal is to show subjugation. The New York Times, I think, described this as, described the original statues as works of Jim Crow era propaganda. All that they've done is now reworked them into works of George Floyd era propaganda. The purpose is not to educate, it's not to provoke thoughtfulness, it's not to promote introspection, but the purpose is to say, these have been conquered, we are the new conquerors culturally. Ancient civilizations, right, used to put the heads of their enemies on pikes to warn of their warn others that they were victorious, or march their enemies, their captured enemies, through the streets. And that's exactly what's happening here. It's impossible not to see the parallels with kind of those ancient heads on spikes versus you see Stonewall Jackson's faceless head hung on top of this kind of mangled statue.
Everyone should go read Elle's excellent piece, Left-Wing Cultural Revolutionaries Are Decapitating Statues and Calling It Art, on the Federalist. Elle, thanks so much for your commentary today. Tell Skipper thanks for your time, and we'll have you back again soon.
Thanks for having us.
Last week, ABC's Dancing with the Stars hosted what they called Dedication Night, where each of the competing couples, which, if you haven't seen the show, is a celebrity who's paired with a professional dancer, they each dedicated their dance to a person or institution that had been influential in the celebrity's life. Sounds like a sweet idea. One of the contestants, Scott Hoying, a singer in the a cappella group Pentatonics, dedicated his dance to his husband, Mark, but then revealed that the two of them are going to be dads. Take a look.
Mark, I'll start with you. How excited were you to be able to join Scott's journey this week?
I was so excited. I'm Scott and Riley's biggest fan. So to have this moment with them felt like a dream come true. And to be able to announce such big news with our pregnancy, with our baby, it is something I will never forget for the rest of my life. We have one more piece of news for you.
What?
We're having a baby. Our surrogate is pregnant.
We're gonna be dads.
Now, I know it can be hard for people to look past the joy on these two men's faces to think critically about what this kind of announcement actually means. After all, many people will make the argument that it's actually pro-life. It's creating children, isn't it? Criticizing decisions like this is always met with accusations of homophobia, bigotry, hatred, and even the attack that if you're really pro-life, you'll celebrate things like this. The exact same arguments are often made when it comes to in vitro fertilization, commonly known as IVF. But IVF and surrogacy and anything else that commodifies human life are fraught with moral and ethical concerns. Here are just a few of the many reasons why Scott and Mark's pregnancy announcement is cause for sadness and not celebration. First, same-sex surrogacy always intentionally deprives a child of his natural right to a mother and father. Framing the desires of adults as civil rights ends in denying children their natural human rights to a mom and dad. Second, surrogacy scars children with undeniable and unavoidable loss. And this loss is not unique to children who are commissioned by same-sex couples. As Katie Faust of Them Before Us often explains, surrogacy splits what should be one person in a child's life, his mom, into what she calls 3 purchasable and optional women. These include the genetic mom, or the one who supplies the egg, the birth mom, with whom the baby forms a primal and pivotal bond, and the social mom, who nurtures the child and satisfies his yearning for a mother's love. Third, surrogacy often exploits financially vulnerable women in order to satiate the desires of adults who want a made-to-order baby. It's not naturally a pro-woman exercise. Fourth, surrogacy enables abuse because although it often includes limited screening, it doesn't include a standard, strict vetting process that adoptive couples must undergo to ensure children's safety and security. As a result, some of the custom-ordered children end up in the hands of pedophiles and other abusers. Surrogacy always includes the possibility of this. Fifth, surrogacy opens the door to eugenics, because most surrogacy pregnancies are created through IVF, where doctors can grade embryo fitness and then discard lab-created human beings who don't have the desired chromosomes or hair color or eye color. From the disposal of unwanted human beings, to the incompleteness of medical records, to the deprivation of half of a child's family, the ethical and moral problems with surrogacy are many. So, don't let people scold you into cheering for surrogacy, and don't let them shame you and trick you into thinking it's pro-life. It is not as dreamy and wonderful as it's cracked up to be. All right, that's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of the Kylee Cast. I will be right back here next week with more. Until then, just remember, the truth hurts, but it won't kill you.